I came back, there was not a single leaf left. They ate it all. You couldn't hear a dog bark in the village, because they were eaten also.
We were told, children, it's very dangerous to go begging for food from house to house now. Terrible crimes are happening. You may not have heard, but a man who was going to the well for water or was coming back from the well fell and froze to death. His wife cut off pieces of his flesh and ate them.
My cousin, who was much younger than I, had 3 children. And those 3 children were eaten by their neighbors.
A directive issued by the Justice Department ensures that no official records of cannibalism are kept. All such cases are withdrawn from the courts and dealt with behind the closed doors of the OGPU secret police. Having killed a quarter of the nation's population, the Soviets staged one of the greatest cover-ups in history. At a grain conference in London, the Soviets campaigned vigorously to raise their grain export quotas from 25 to 85 million bushels of wheat. The scheme is effective. Few can imagine a state exporting grain at the cost of its own people's lives. Indignant over the mass unemployment and hardships in their own countries, many influential socialist sympathizers unwittingly rally to Moscow's defense. George Bernard Shaw and a party of leading British socialites visit the USSR and report quite truthfully that the restaurants where they eat are full of food. Another important foreign guest to receive the red carpet treatment is former French Prime Minister Édouard Herriot. He is actually given a 5-day guided tour of Ukraine at the height of the famine. His favorable impressions of the country receive widespread publicity.
I would like to thank the government and the people of the Soviet Union for their warm reception.
Johann von Herwart was a young attaché at the German embassy in Moscow, and after the Second World War, German ambassador to Great Britain. He recalls how the Soviets stage-managed Herriot's entire trip.
The famous visit of the president of the French cabinet, Herriot, when he came to Kiev, when he had the impression that everything was all right in Kiev. The streets were well cleaned through which he drove. He got a wonderful breakfast in his hotel, and then in the streets there were trucks labeled bread, and bread was unloaded, and everything seemed to be fine. And then he went to see a collective farm, and when he spoke to the farmers, nobody knows if they were really farmers or put there just for the inspection of Herriot. They told him that everything was fine, much better than under the Tsars, and he came home and said, there's no famine in Ukraine, the peasants are very happy.
Idealized scenes of work and happy peasant life are the staple diet in Soviet movie theaters as the famine rages on. A sensational show trial is staged in Moscow to further help distract the Soviet people from the failures of the 5-year plan. 6 British engineers working in the USSR face the death sentence on trumped-up charges of sabotage, espionage, and bribery. The interest the trial arouses in the West gives the Soviets extra leverage to muzzle the foreign press corps. correspondents are bluntly told that if they want access to the trial, they are not to mention the famine in their dispatches. Having served their purpose, the British saboteurs are eventually released. Malcolm Muggeridge arrived in the USSR in 1932. He was one of the very few journalists to defy the Soviet travel ban and report on the real conditions in the countryside.
I don't think that foreigners realize sufficiently how completely the Soviet authorities can control the foreign press. The censorship worked simply that if you wrote a message, you had to take it along to the press department. I mean, the telegraph company wouldn't accept it unless it was stamped by them. You had to submit it to them. And they would read it through, and they would say, you can't say that. As I began to be very critical of the whole setup, to criticize the use of terrorism by the government, the articles that I wrote on the famine would undoubtedly, I would have had to leave. But I sent those over in a diplomatic bag. They would never have got out of the country otherwise. And I left before they had appeared.
For every article on the famine that appeared, 2 were published denying its existence. Muggeridge recalls the most influential correspondent in Moscow was Walter Duranty, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times.
He was not only the greatest liar among the journalists in Moscow, but he was the greatest liar of any journalist that I ever met in the 50 years of journalism. And we used to wonder whether, in fact, the authorities hadn't got some kind of hold over him, because he so utterly played their game. But it didn't worry the New York Times, who featured his reports. When it came to the famine, the great famine in the Ukraine, brought about by collectivization, that was when his reporting was particularly disgraceful, because he denied that there was any famine.
The Soviets actually grant Duranty permission to tour Ukraine unchaperoned. He reports in the Times that all talk of famine now is ridiculous. Yet documents from the British Foreign Office reveal that in private conversations at the British Embassy, Duranty said as many as 10 million people had died.
When they were discussing the question of recognizing the Soviet Union, the United States government recognizing the Soviet Union, the articles of Duranty were considered as very valuable evidence on the side of recognition.
Shortly after Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov visits Washington in November 1933, the U.S. recognizes the Soviet government and enters agreements securing a balance of trade in favor of the United States. The following year, the Soviet cover-up achieves its ultimate success, a seat in the League of Nations. And this in spite of the fact Western governments knew all about the famine.
The government of Weimar, the democratic government, was very aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union. But the attitude of the government was, I would say, you could call it passive. And we, the younger ones of the embassy, we always were of the opinion then at that period that we ought not to have any commercial relations with a criminal government which allowed hundreds of thousands and even millions of people to starve. The government said, we have already great unemployment in Germany, and if we stop delivering the manufactured goods to the Soviet Union, would increase unemployment in Germany. That was the situation.
Trade relations take precedence. The famine is regarded as a strictly internal Soviet affair. The Western governments make their peace with genocide. The communist writer Mykola Krylovy reacts to the destruction of his people by starvation, the mass arrests of his friends and party members by taking his life. The party strongman Mykola Skripnik is denounced as an enemy of the state. He, too, commits suicide.
Це були These suicides came to symbolically represent the end of an epoch in the history of Ukraine.
Up to